My name is Andrew Bayer, and this is 7 Habits of Highly Effective Jenkins Users. Who am I? I'm the Build and Tools Architect at Cloudera up in San Francisco. I'm a contributor to Jenkins Core and author and contributor to a number of plugins since the spring of 2009. I'm a committer and PNC member of a bunch of Apache projects. And I'm a member of the Apache Software Foundation and volunteer maintaining builds.apache.org, the Jenkins instance for all the Apache projects. So what is this talk about? These are the lessons that I've learned from maintaining a whole bunch of different large-scale Jenkins instances over the 5.5 years that I've been active in Jenkins. Most specifically, the 3 masters with 1,000+ jobs each, so almost 5,000 total jobs at Cloudera, where we're running dozens at a time on physical slaves, VM slaves, dynamically provisioned cloud slaves, you name it. Builds.apache.org, which has over 1,200 jobs from around 120 different project teams. So that's a whole different challenge of having a whole lot of different projects that are not connected all on one master, and again, a large scale. And my time on the Jenkins IRC channel, working on core and plugins, reading on Twitter, talking with people, etc. Your mileage may vary. I believe that these habits can be valuable on pretty much every Jenkins instance, or at least a lot of them can be. Some are more relevant at a larger scale, or for more complex jobs, or production-critical instances. But I think there's value in a lot of them, even at a small scale. And these are my recommendations. They're not necessarily the one thing you should do, the one way you should do things. You need to learn what's best for your Jenkins setup based on your requirements, your needs, and your use case. So the first habit is make your master stable and restorable. And the first and best way to do that is use LTS releases. The LTS, as Kosuke mentioned in the keynote, releases, the trains get cut about every 12 weeks. There's 3 updates on each LTS train before we cut the next one. They're more stable. They go through automated testing. They only have a minimal amount of critical bug fixes backported to them. A lot of plugin developers try to target LTS releases for their plugin in terms of what they depend on. And meanwhile, Bleeding Edge, which releases weekly, is unsurprisingly kind of unstable. If you're running the latest release of Jenkins proper in production, thank you, but you're kind of a sucker. Yeah. So yeah, you should be definitely running an LTS release for any Jenkins master that matters. Be conservative about upgrading your plugins. Plugins can change a lot without it being obvious, especially not from the Jenkins UI, or even necessarily from the wiki page if you go look at that. But with enough plugins, you're probably not even going to bother looking at the wiki page before you upgrade. There have been cases where backwards compatibility has been broken by a plugin going from one version to the next. The extended email plugins, recipient and trigger settings broke sometime this spring for backwards compatibility. And that was a giant pain because suddenly we upgraded and all of our build emails did not work right. Weren't sending to the right people, we're sending to too many people, et cetera. So you need to be careful with that kind of stuff. And new features in plugins that, even if they don't break any backwards compatibility, just as with new features in Jenkins Core, they tend to be unstable, or at least more likely to be unstable than stuff that's been around for a while. So be careful about upgrading your plugins. Make sure you know what you're getting into. Make sure you've got a good reason to upgrade. And be ready for it. And speaking of that, you should have an upgrade test bed. You need to test out upgrades of core or plugins, or adding new plugins in a lot of cases, within a testbed environment before you go live in production. You want to set up jobs to cover your key plugin usage. Make sure that the new versions still do what you expect them to do once you go into production. If at all possible, you want to test your usage at scale. If you're running with thousands of jobs and hundreds of slaves or executors, you're likely to hit some edge cases in production that may not be getting hit in pre-release testing, even for LTSs. So you want to make sure that you're trying to replicate your environment as closely as you can in your test bed. And you want to give everything a few days to soak in. Don't just assume, hey, my build ran once, everything's good. You want to make sure that it can run a few times, it can do polling, it won't end up eating itself with memory hell after a while. I mean, you're not going to catch everything. You don't want to spend a month and a half with a Jenkins master testbed soaking. But you want to at least feel like you've covered the areas that you've seen problems before or that you're aware could be problematic. And of course, backup. I mean, who here is not backing up their Jenkins configuration? Come on, admit it. Most of you admit it. Yeah, come on. Okay, and I guess that how many people aren't aware whether or not they're backing up their Jenkins configuration? A lot of liars. Yeah, there's another person. You tend not to start backing up your Jenkins master until somebody runs a job that runs on master that does an rm-rf. It's happened to me a couple times. I've done it even. There's a lot of different ways you can do that backup. There's no one right way. I know Jenkins Enterprise has backup solutions that are probably better than what's out there in the open source world, but I haven't used them because I'm not paying for Jenkins Enterprise yet. But within the open source plugins, I recommend the Thin Backup plugin. It's fairly lightweight, it's fairly smart, it's fairly simple. There's other options that can be a little bit more insane in terms of how much stuff they back up. I mean, do you really want to be backing up every build ever? Probably not. So yeah, you could just do an rsync full copy of Jenkins Home, and that's among the backup approaches that I use in production because it's not perfect. Things can change while it's running, but I back up everything. But that can be slow, and if you archive a lot of artifacts, have big log files, have a lot of builds, that can eat up a lot of disk. The other approach that I use is a kind of hacky little combination of scripts to just back up what I know are important config files, putting them in Git, and committing them on a nightly basis. It's just one of many options, like I said. But the important thing is that you find one that actually preserves what you think is relevant. Maybe you do care about keeping every build forever. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. You need to figure out what the right solution is for your use case and start doing it. Definitely before you upgrade. So this one, yeah, avoid using the Maven job type. I don't like saying this. I like the Maven job type. My first contributions to Jenkins core were adding functionality to the Maven job type. It's nifty. It smells Maven. It goes in there. It can tell which module is doing what. It's really pretty. It's kind of ugly internally. I'm not talking about running a Maven build step within your freestyle job. I'm talking about the separate Maven job type. It's implemented as a separate job type, so a lot of plugins that expect a certain level of consistency in your jobs may get a little weirded out by the Maven job type, especially considering it counts each module as a separate build. And things can just go a little weird, especially at scale, where it's just creating too many files, too many changes, too much disk I/O, you name it. Second habit, break up the bloat. If you have a lot of projects and teams, multiple masters can give you a lot more agility and control than you can get from just one single master. There's a bunch of different ways you can split up those masters. Some places do it by team or project. Some places do it by function or who gets access to what. That I don't have any hard and fast recommendations on. But splitting up your Jenkins masters like that makes it dramatically easier to do restarts for a plugin install or a plugin upgrade without disrupting everybody else besides just the small subset of your users who care about that plugin. You also have to do more plugin upgrades, et cetera, if you've got everybody on one master, so the problem just gets worse. Less jobs means less memory footprint, means less CPU usage, less disk usage, et cetera. It just keeps things more sane and stable. Yeah. Break up your jobs. Modularization and reuse are good in programming, obviously, and they're good in Jenkins. Multi-job builds allow you to reuse generic jobs across multiple projects, releases, et cetera, without having to just cut and paste repeatedly. There are a few things more frustrating than a 10-hour build crashing 9.5 hours in. And with a multi-job build, you can relaunch it at any step along the process if you've got it designed right. Obviously, the workflow plugin that Kosuke has been talking about deals with a lot of these issues while still having actually one job, but I count that as a multi-job build because it's basically emulating this behavior. It's being able to treat your individual steps, your individual actions independently. And it just makes things much, much cleaner, much easier to reuse. Some tools for breaking up your jobs. There are a ton of ways you can do this, so don't take these are just a few things that come off the top of my head. What I use is a parameterized trigger plus conditional build step, and to a lesser extent, the copy artifact and promoted builds plugins. They're kind of the assembly language equivalent for this stuff. They're low level, but they give you an absurd amount of control over what you're doing in terms of how your jobs interact with each other, adding conditional logic so your builds can behave differently depending on what their children did, what environment they're running in, et cetera. But like I said, they require a bit more work to get going than some of the other plugins that are coming along in more recent times, especially the workflow plugin. The build pipeline plugin is a good way to visualize your workflow and integrate manual steps into that workflow. And of course, the workflow plugin, which you already heard some about and you're going to hear more about if you go to Kosuke's talk later this afternoon. Third habit, automate Jenkins tasks. Who likes doing things by hand? That's boring, especially if you have to do it more than once. With the script console and the scriptler plugin, you can get deep into the Jenkins internals. You can control them. You can get into the object model, get full visibility of what's going on, and make significant changes in an automated way. You can do things like make changes to jobs across the board, hunt down problem configurations like, say, when the extended email plugin changes around your trigger and recipient settings, and reuse those using scriptler to store and share those groovy scripts, either for just yourself or you can share them on the scriptler repositories that are available online. Just some example jobs or scripts that are in the scriptler catalogs that I think are pretty representative of the kind of things that you can pretty easily do. You could disable or enable jobs matching a pattern. I can't tell you how handy that is whenever we have a release and I'm like, okay, these 30 jobs no longer need to run. You can clear the build queue, configure log rotation, the discard old builds configuration across all your jobs so that you can enforce a standard there. You can turn off SCM polling at night if you don't want builds running at night or during the day or weekends or whatever other time you feel like. And probably the one I like the most, you can run the log rotator and actually discard old builds from all jobs after you've changed their configuration to discard more builds, because otherwise it won't happen until you run another build. That has saved so much disk space for me. Another thing you can do is use the Groovy plugin's system Groovy build steps to run those Groovy scripts, system-level Groovy scripts, as part of your actual build, so that your build itself is going in and messing with Jenkins itself. You got to remember that to do this, the build process has full access to Jenkins, so you want to be careful about who can run those, who can write those, so that they don't end up going and, deleting everything. It's a really, really good way to pilot plugin concepts, or to do small things that you're not going to end up needing to do over and over, or at a really large scale, but still want to have built into Jenkins. Because you can write you can write plugins in Groovy, so you can basically take the same code and translate it into a plugin pretty easily. And you can run the scriptler scripts as build steps with this, so that you can have your shared system script that you're running. Sometimes I have to run it by hand, sometimes I run it in a job that runs regularly or whatever, and you can have the same code in multiple places. It's handy. Generate jobs programmatically. So nobody likes copying or creating jobs by hand, so a lot of us will do the copy from another job when we're creating new jobs, at least as a starting point. But even that gets unwieldy at scale. You have to do it a lot. You may forget to change some field in a couple of the jobs, and next thing you know, you've broken everything. With the REST API and CLI, you can post new jobs as XML or post changes to jobs that are already existing from the command line or scripting or whatever. Or, and this is what I find more interesting, you can define your whole job and or workflow of multiple jobs, or workflow of a single job in the case of the workflow plugin, in a DSL. Some examples of DSL plugins. My personal favorite is the Job DSL plugin. It's a full Groovy DSL for defining your jobs. You have a lot of plugins that are supported directly in its syntax, and for anything else that isn't, you can easily use Groovy's builder syntax to define the plugin configuration directly. You can check that, you check the DSL in, you can have your build step invoke it and create those jobs. You can poll when there's changes to the DSL and automatically update the jobs. It does require a certain level of knowledge of what the plugins are doing to know what configuration you want to be using everywhere, so it is perhaps more of a power tool than some of the other tools out there, but I admit to a bit of a bias towards the power tools. The .ci plugin, which Kosuke mentioned, works kind of like Travis CI or Circle CI, where you define your jobs in a YAML file that's checked in, and the jobs are, for that branch and repository, are created automatically based on the contents of that YAML. It's more opinionated, it's more limited in terms of the scope it can reach out to. It can't do quite as much as you can do with the Job DSL plugin, but it's a lot simpler to start from scratch with. You don't have to write a whole bunch of stuff defining all your plugins. You can just write a few lines of YAML and you've got a basic build. And similar to that is the upcoming Literate plugin, which uses a markdown-like syntax for defining your job in your project source, and also allows you to interweave comments. It has some natural language logic that confuses me. Fairly similar to the .ci plugin in that regard, but I believe it's able to reach out to more aspects. It's more configurable than the .ci plugin is. And of course, the workflow plugin. So rather than talking about what it is, I'll talk about why I don't think you should use it yet, at least not in production. It's really new. I mean, it started, being available in early forms in late spring, I believe. There is yet to be a Jenkins LTS release that supports the current version of it. And if you remember my first habit, you should always be running LTS in production. It's a new job type, so unlike with the job DSL plugin, which works within your existing job types, you'd have to create all your jobs all over again to fit into the workflow plugin. And if you've got enough inertia and enough jobs, that can be arduous and potentially problematic. So I think it needs some more maturity and some more time. I mean, if you want to use it, great. I would actually highly recommend using it in development environments where you're trying to figure out what you want to be doing with Jenkins in a few months. I think it's going to be a fantastic tool that will make a number of the other plugins I've mentioned, maybe not obsolete, but definitely less critical. But I don't think it's there yet, and I think it will take time. So in production, be wary. Habit 4, tend your plugin garden. Dear Mr. Jenkins, there are too many plugins these days. Please eliminate 300. P.S. I am not a crackpot. There are 1,000 plus plugins now. That is too many plugins. If you installed all of them, I think your head would explode. If not, Jenkins' head definitely would explode. So you want to think carefully before you install a new plugin. Do you really need it? Is there a specific purpose that value you're going to get from installing that plugin on your master? Have you tried it out in a test environment first? Do you know how you're going to use it? Are you sure it's stable? Are you sure that another plugin that touches on similar content is not a better option for you? And that one actually comes up too, that with all that overlap of plugins, if you were thinking, hey, maybe I'll write a plugin to do this functionality that I want, if there's another plugin out there that's pretty similar, try to find a way that you can integrate what you need into that plugin rather than starting a completely new plugin, because that makes it harder to discover plugins, et cetera. And plugins can cause instability in areas that you may not expect, and in some cases can add a lot of load and run time to your jobs, because there's more XML it has to read, more history it has to read, et cetera. So if you're not going to use a plugin, why have it installed? Why install it in the first place? Why not remove a plugin that you're no longer using? So you should clean up your old plugins and their data. It's not just a matter of uninstalling or disabling the unused and unneeded plugins in all cases. You want to watch for that note about old data that shows up in Manage Jenkins periodically, and go through it and clear out the old data when you uninstall plugins. It'll slim down your job and build config files by removing information for plugins that are no longer present, and that can play a pretty critical role in optimizing the load time for your jobs. Again, that's something, the load time for your jobs you're not really going to run into unless you're at a large scale. Used to be that if you had 50 jobs, you'd run into that, but with lazy loading, it's a lot smoother. But when you get to the 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 job level, you're going to hit it again, and you want to be careful about not wasting time that you don't need to. So a few of my favorite plugins, well, the ones I consider just kind of essential. The job config history plugin does pretty much what it says. It keeps a history of all your changes to your jobs and the general Jenkins configuration. And it records who did them, assuming you have authentication and authorization enabled. It's not source control exactly, though it can do reversion, and it does show you diffs, et cetera. But it's just handy. I mean, even just seeing a little icon show up next to a build when it's the first one that's run since a change in your job config is handy. And it just gives you an idea at a glance, oh wait, maybe that's why this build failed. So for a long time, I said the disk usage plugin was one of my essential plugins, but at least as of a few months ago, I hate it. They made some changes so that it's doing a lot more loading than it used to, a lot more disk I/O and memory usage and background threads, and it just kind of went insane. It ended up blocking jobs from finishing for 15, 20 minutes. So it's a good example of why you need to be careful about plugin upgrades, and that there was nothing obvious to me that the disk usage plugin's behavior was going to be changing like that, but it did. The static analysis family of plugins are, of course, great. It's a consistent way to report on a huge array of different tools, check style, find bugs, lots. The XUnit plugin is really handy if you're not using JUnit. If you're not using a test tool that's spitting out JUnit XML or another test report format that Jenkins knows natively, or that there's a plugin that knows natively. Because it can convert a whole lot of different test formats into JUnit format that Jenkins speaks natively. So that way you can take, I think it does like Visual Studio test output, PHP test output, lots and lots of different test output, and still get that really nice test reporting that Jenkins gives you. Like I mentioned, I love the parameterized trigger and conditional build step plugins. Being able to chain builds together and wait for them to finish, and pass different parameters to them depending on context, et cetera, and then being able to add conditional logic is massive. It takes Jenkins from being, hey, here's this one little build, to, hey, here's this whole suite of builds. The tool environment plugin. Now, if you're in a fairly homogeneous environment where all your builds are Ruby builds, all your builds are Maven builds, you probably don't need this. You can use the build step plugin for your particular tool pretty consistently. But if you're in a more homogeneous or more heterogeneous environment where sometimes you're running stuff as part of a build step, sometimes your tool's build step, sometimes you're running them from the command line in a shell, sometimes you're running them in all kinds of other permutations. The tool environment plugin is great because it lets you use the Jenkins tool auto installation from shell scripts in other environments, so that you can have Jenkins auto install the JDK version you want, and set an environment variable that you can then use. The env-inject plugin seems to be the best option for setting environment variables in your build in a whole bunch of different ways. I say seems to because this is an area that a lot of different plugins have played in, and so there may be a better option out there right now than the env-inject plugin. The rebuild plugin. I love the rebuild plugin. It's one of those plugins where once you've been using it for a while, you have no idea why it wasn't just part of core. The ability to click a failed build, click rebuild, run it again automatically with the same parameters without having to go copy and paste all the parameters again. Really simple, really wonderful. And the build timeout plugin. Builds hang. This plugin deals with that. It will abort, kill, abort or fail jobs depending on your configuration based on a set timeout, an elastic timeout, how long it's been since there was output in the build log, all kinds of different ways you can detect whether a build is hung. And yeah, it's just another one of those things that is so core that I forget that it's a separate plugin. But don't take my word for it about what plugins are the most important. Those are the ones I feel are essential based on my experience and my use cases. And I think that a lot of them will be useful to a lot of you in your use cases. But you may not need them. You may need completely different plugins. But in general, these are plugins that I think have a lot of versatility and a lot of value and not that much risk. And I think that's important, is to understand which plugins can give you value without also hosing you. And when you install a new plugin, don't forget the global configuration. It's easy to think that a plugin that's a build step related plugin or something like that, you just install it and then go reconfigure your builds to use it. But some plugins have global config settings that you need to remember to look at. The defaults may not always work for you, and sometimes the defaults are bad. As a great example, the job config history plugin, which I touted just a moment ago, by default, it saves its idea of changes for every Maven module separately, because from Jenkins' perspective, each Maven module is actually a separate project, it's internal stuff. There's almost never anything that changes in them, but you still get a different file each time you save the parent job. It goes insane in terms of the number of history XML files it keeps around. So you want to take a look at that stuff and say, is that really an option I want? Is that doing something I care about? If you don't, you end up with the risk of things going a little crazy. Habit 5, integrate with other tools and services. Jenkins plays nicely with others. Thanks to the Jenkins plugins and the REST API, other services and tools can very easily interact with Jenkins and vice versa. You can trigger builds based on GitHub pull requests, update Jira upon successful builds, and a whole lot more. I'm only going to touch on a few examples of that here. You can find a ton more on the Jenkins wiki. Source control. Yeah, of course you're going to use a source control plugin. I mean, how else are you going to get the source control? So yeah, moving on. Gerrit and GitHub pull requests. The Gerrit trigger, is Robert in here? No, he isn't. The open source GitHub pull request builder plugin and the Jenkins Enterprise version of GitHub pull request builder, they're all very useful. You can build every proposed change before it's actually committed and report back to the review tool, be it Gerrit or GitHub. And with this, you can enable automatic merging of changes, automatic promotion of, from one branch to another when it meets certain conditions. There's all kinds of things you can do with managing your code, not just your builds, thanks to this. I personally like the Jenkins Enterprise pull request builder best because it's the least opinionated of these things, and so it's more flexible in your workflows. But if you, with something like Gerrit, you give up a certain level of control of your workflow, but of your code review workflow especially, but you get immense power in terms of triggering and building and testing all of your changes before they can ever get in. Jira. So there are a few, I think, Jira plugins for Jenkins. You can update Jira issues when commits with those Jira issues are built. You can follow the build fingerprints to update issues in related projects as well as the immediate project that you're building. And you can generate Jira release notes as part of the build process, which is handy. Artifactory, my personal favorite Maven repo manager. You can define your credentials for deployment and artifact resolution globally across your jobs. That way you don't have to have nem2 settings.xml on every one of your slaves. You don't have to worry about specifying credentials in your jobs, et cetera. You can override the distribution management section from your Maven POMs on a per job basis so that you don't have to go change a open source project's POM file if you want to deploy it to your Maven repo. You can restrict where those Maven jobs and build steps are running, where they're going to look to find their artifacts. So you can say, don't look at the staging, just look at production repos. And you can capture the information about the builds and the relationship to the artifacts in Artifactory so that you can get auditing and trackability on your builds and on their artifacts. Habit 6, make your slaves fungible. So what does that mean? Fungibility is the property of a good or a commodity whose individual units are capable of mutual substitution. In other words, a fungible slave is a slave you can very easily replace with another slave without having to just recreate that exact slave. If one dies or all your slaves for a particular label are busy, no problem, just add another one. The easier it is to add slaves to Jenkins, the easier your life's going to be. And the easier it is to recreate your build environments, the better you're going to be. So how do you do that? The first part is that you need to make sure your environments are easily repeatable. That if you set up a build environment or slave environment today, that you know you can recreate it 6 months from now. So that you can, for example, rebuild a patch for an existing release in the same environment that the original release was built in. You can do that by using config management tools or by pre-baked images in cloud or Pixie booting, et cetera, using something like Packer, one of my favorite tools, and using config management to build them. I am not going to tell you which config management tool you should use because it doesn't matter. What matters is just that you use a config management tool. Anything that can give you a consistent environment does the trick. Reusability and flexibility are also key. If you try your best to make your slaves as general purpose as possible, unless you have no other choice, don't narrowly purpose them for just one job or set of jobs. Interchangeable slaves allow for much more efficient usage of those slaves. Excuse me. And if you do need specific custom slaves, like for example at Cloudera, we need to do packaging builds on a ton of different platforms. So we try to make those on demand, not always committed physical or VMs. We don't run builds on Ubuntu 10.04 very often, so why do we need to have always on Ubuntu 10.04 slaves? Let's spin those up on the fly when we need them, not leave them always on when we don't. And on that note, the cloud. And I'm using it in a really general purpose here. Not any specific cloud, not necessarily public or private, or even cloud. I mean, VMware is fine for this. Docker is fine for this. The important thing is to get better and a more efficient usage of your resources, either financial or compute. Whether it's in the private cloud or the public cloud, it depends on your use case and what you need to do, whether you need to restrict access to the machines, whether you don't care, whether you have a private cloud. The important thing is to try to avoid having idle resources, idle slaves that can't be used for anything but that one specific task. The Mesos plugin with Docker, which I believe is being discussed in a talk later today, is really intriguing. If you're already using Mesos for cluster management stuff in your workplace, with this you can piggyback on that with Jenkins and have your slaves running in that Mesos cluster. I think that's an interesting angle that we may see more of in the future. And pre-bake your cloud slave images. Don't just have them boot up from a vanilla Ubuntu image and then you run Puppet on them after when Jenkins has started them up. Bake your images in. Bake the tools you need in. Make sure that it looks the way you want it to, and then save that. You can do that by hand, or you can use a tool like Packer to script that. I personally adore Packer, so I recommend that. Habit 7, join the community, which you've kind of already done since you're here. Get involved. Write plugins. Even better, extend existing plugins. Open JIRAs. How are Jenkins devs or plugin devs going to know what bugs there are if nobody tells them, right? It seems like pretty basic, but a lot of people never think to open a JIRA. If you hit a problem, take a look on the Jenkins JIRA, see if anyone's run into the same problem, and if they haven't, open a JIRA. Worst case is it gets ignored. And a lot of them probably do get ignored. There's 20 some odd thousand. But it's still better than not saying anything. And even better, fix bugs. If you run into a bug on a plugin and you're familiar with the language the plugin's written in, why not take a look? Check it out on GitHub. See if you can figure out where it's going wrong, and if you've got a fix for it, submit a pull request. Eventually, you'll get sucked in to the point where you're a major Jenkins contributor, just like I did. And you can always get help on the Jenkins mailing lists or on IRC. It's #Jenkins CI on Freenode. It's all on the website. There's almost always people active on the IRC channel. There are a lot of European and Asian Jenkins users and contributors, so it's pretty close to 24/7. It's very, very handy, and a lot of people just lurk in there and wait to see, and if something pops up that is of interest to them, they'll say something. And it's also an easy way to contact a lot of Jenkins devs. Like there's somebody sitting in the front row here who's IM'd me a few times about Jenkins issues via RSC. So yeah, and help others. So it's not just a matter of coming in and asking for help. If you feel like if you're lurking in the IRC channel and someone asks a question that you feel like you can answer, go ahead, do it. You don't need, there's no authority that you have to pass first before you can do something like that. Just jump in. Any questions?